So we have to click start. So little technical glitch there. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Pat Tinto, president of the National Organization of Italian American Women. NOIAW recently celebrated its 40th anniversary as a nonprofit dedicated to empowering, connecting, and inspiring women through their shared Italian heritage. We offer educational, cultural, and social programs through our 4 regions in Greater New York, Greater Washington, D.C., which includes Virginia and Maryland, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And through the use of social media platforms and Zoom, we have been expanding our reach nationally and also internationally. With limited availability to hold in-person meetings, we are fortunate today that the Newark Library offered us their auditorium, and we're here in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And this will allow us to reach more people, and whereas we can't gather in person. And today, our program entitled Heroines and Heritage features 2 Italian-American authors in conversation about how their heritage influences their writing. The 2 novels here, The Last Stop on the 6th and The Italian Love Cake, are both published by Bordighera Press. And they're available online for purchase through NOIAW Books, the Italian-American bookstore that will reopen soon in Boston. There is a link in the chat room and for you to purchase. And also, we are offering to NOIAW members a 10% discount on the purchase of the book. And I believe he offers free shipping. Currently, I'm in Connecticut with Stanford resident Patricia Dunn, who's here on my right, and she's the author of The Last Stop on the 6th. Pat Dunn is a self-described Italian rebel raised in the Bronx. She's the author of the young adult novels Rebel by Accident, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Salon, The Village Voice, The Nation, LA Weekly, and the Christian Science Monitor. Dunn has served as a senior director of the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College, where she holds an MFA in creative writing. She's the co-founder of the Joe Papaleo Writers Workshop in Citera, Italy. We are joined through the magic of Zoom by author Gail Reitano, who's there with us from the Bay Area of California. Gail, who wrote The Italian Love Cake, grew up in southern New Jersey, Pine Barrens, where her main character in the book is also from. She graduated from Rutgers University and lived in London for 12 years before moving to the San Francisco Bay Area. Her fiction, memoir, and essays have appeared in Glimmer Train, Catamaran Literary Reader, Ovunque Siamo, and the anthology Songs of Ourselves, America's Interior Landscape, as well as she's been featured on public radio in the Bay Area. And The Italian Love Cake, also the Bordighera Press, is her first novel. The French translation, Liberata, is coming out in May 2022. So to start today's conversation, I wanted to mention the recurrence of similar themes I noted while reading both books, especially the looming presence of conflicts, both real and imaginary. Although the books are set about 50 years apart, they each are set within the historical context of a family life following World War II or the impending Gulf War of the 1990s. They also feature fraught mother and daughter relationships, conflicts between faith and family, women and Catholicism, and then there is the omnipresent role of food in relationships and power dynamics. So let's use today's program as a jumping off point. So I know one of you told me when we were going through the preparation meeting that this title, Heritage, that they thought that the best title for this program would be Heroines of Heritage. So maybe you can explain how this applies to both your books and why we're here today.
Gail, would you like to start or you want me to jump in?
Sure.
I'll just put you on the spot there.
Why not? Thank you so much, Pat Tinto. Thanks to the Norwalk Library and to NOIAW for hosting this, and to NOIAW Books being our fabulous bookstore that supports Italian and Italian-American writers, and especially to NOIAW that focuses on our lives and our careers as Italian-American women, and now our literature. It's so encouraging to have that support for our work. I guess that what Pat and I have both done in our novels is kind of present how we were raised, and how we incorporate, I see it as how we incorporate Italy into our Italian-American lives, and how Italy is a part of our Italian-American lives. And this has been a challenge for me as a writer to present that. And I have wanted to a phrase I like to use is drag the thread of Italy through into America, because I think in the push to assimilate, a lot of it got pushed away. A lot of us stopped speaking the language. I have several relatives who claim to be allergic to garlic. They weren't using olive oil. My mother was cooking out of the Julia Child cookbook until my father took over the kitchen. So I think that's why we're heroines of heritage, you and me, Pat, and so many others, because a lot of Bordighera authors, because we're trying to bring our Italian backgrounds to life. So
I also want to thank NOIAW, and I'm a recent member. I'm very proud to be. And thank you, Gail, and the NOIAW Public Library, and everybody for coming today. And Bordighera Press and NOIAW Books. They're out of Boston. They just opened up their store, which is great, but they support Italian and authors and Italian American authors, and they're wonderful. And they're also offering discounts to people who are here today. And anyway, I just can't say that it's so hard to be a bookstore today, as it is to be a writer, as it is to run an organization that's nonprofit. And so thank you, everybody. Okay, so enough with the thanks. It's funny, I didn't even realize how Italian I was until I left the Bronx. I grew up in a place called Pelham Bay, which is the last stop on the 6th if you're coming from Manhattan or the other side of the city. But it was the first stop for us, right by Pelham Bay Park, which is one of the largest city parks in the country and bigger than Central Park. Anyway, I throw that in. I got that from a German tourist, but people don't usually know that. But when I moved out to LA, I lived out in LA for about 12 years. All of a sudden, people kept referring to me as being Italian. And where I grew up, everybody was born on the other side. We never asked the other side of what, because we all knew that meant Southern Italy. That was the original title of this book. But everybody thought I was, they referred to me as Italian. What does that mean? Because in my neighborhood, we were the Americans. My family's Italian American, but we were called the Americans. Which kind of always put me on the outside, which I think is probably part of the reason why I started writing. And it also meant that when I ate over my friend's house, I didn't have to eat, or my friend's homes, I didn't have to eat tripe like the other kids did, because they'd be like, oh, you won't like it, you're American. So I was like, okay, that's fine. So my Italian American culture came into this book, I think, because I was writing about the family and the world I grew up in. I, like the main character, was also an activist, which is why it also takes place at the verge of the first war that we went to with Iraq. But it's really at the heart of it, this relationship between this family and this woman who left home for 10 years. And when she comes back, she has all these ideas about the home that she grew up in the neighborhood that was not really what that place was about, right? Can you go home again? Yes, but what is it that you go home to? And she was bringing a lot of her own stereotypes, which I think all our books try to do, is break down what those stereotypes of Italian Americans are, right? So she has to break down a lot of the stereotypes that she thought, like there's some undercurrents where she thinks things are mafia related, which aren't. But I don't want to give away anything in the book, but there's a lot of things also about, especially women in this culture. And I think the strongest characters in this in the book, and that I tend to write about, and I don't even know if I did it consciously, are the women characters, because they just are, whether they control the whatever, in my day, it was like my grandmother, she controlled the kitchen, but she controlled everything else too, right? So it was, so that those themes are very interesting to kind of like play with. And it was like that with watching all the women in my neighborhood, where the men, and this is the stereotypical idea that, the men are like the one in charge, but really behind the scenes, it was always the woman, right? I think we talked before about how it's always about food. It's like, yeah, well, if you're controlling the food, you're controlling everything, right? So you feed people and you can poison people, right? So it's like, there's a lot of power in the kitchen that people don't realize. So anyway, so heritage is a lot to do with it, consciously or unconsciously. And I think now seeing women writers, Italian and of other backgrounds and heritages, is very exciting, because we weren't getting a lot of credit for a long time. So, or even we weren't being noticed. And I think Ferrante from Italy, like helped that in recent years. But I think there's been a lot of other amazing Italian American and Italian authors too that are women.
So I think we'll get to Ferrante a little bit later, but I'm thinking about going back to what we're talking about, feeling in what Gail was saying about the acceptance and rebelling, the push and the pull between the generations. And, sometimes, finding their rituals hard to understand, but then yet going back home and finding comfort in these rituals and the traditions. And how do you explain, how do you just find that compatible with where you are going, forging your own path? So I thought it was interesting that Pat can maybe tell us a little bit, Gail, a little bit about her book, The Italian Love Cake, because the title is kind of a puzzle, where that's coming in, or is it about a bakery, what it's really about. But when the book is translated, which is in French, it's using the word liberata or liberated or independent, or is this really about the independent one? And how is that a struggle all the time? If you grow up Italian American with a strong family and you break apart, where do you go next? I mean, how does that, I've just the old saying, I once heard someone say that, Italian American girl leaves the house in one of two ways, in a wedding gown or in a box. And so it's like, that was always in the back of my mind, So how about if it became a nun? Does that count?
Yes.
But anyway, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking this liberata and the idea of, how can you tell us about your Italian love cake, how those themes come out?
Well, Italian Love Cake was the working title, and it was the title that was with me from the beginning. And I can't even, it's because I found a recipe in the St. Joseph's Church cookbook that my aunt put together that was sold on the 16th of July, Our Lady of Mount Carmel at the carnival. There was a great stack of them. So I bought a bunch of them and I went home, and the recipes were pretty awful. They were everything had Cool Whip, and there was no real cream or anything. It was just Jello, and it was all the things that we used in the 50s, still. And the Italian Love Cake is a box cake. In fact, there's this chef who actually won the Great American Baking Show, and she tried to come up with a from scratch recipe for me for Italian Love Cake, but it is a box cake and it needs the chemistry of the box cake. It can't be made from scratch. But anyway, that's a long explanation for that title. But Marie Genovese, my main character, was always a feminist. I wanted to recreate a woman in the time of my grandmother, which was the late 30s, early 40s, and have that woman have the agency and the choices she would have now. So in that respect, the book opens in 1938. It ends right before Pearl Harbor in 1941. So Pat Dunn and I have in common, as you pointed out, Pat Tinto, that we both have wars in our book. And I think the effect of war on women, there's a whole confluence of things I think that's pretty interesting, and threads between our two books, but also how women deal in war. And my main character, it's pre-World War II. The Depression is lingering. She's inherited the 5 and 10 on the main street. Her mother has died suddenly. She's in her early 20s. She has too much responsibility. She starts having an affair with a married man, and her life gets very complicated very quickly, but she is so strong because my grandmother was so strong. And we all know as Italian American women, how strong we really are. So I wanted to make a portrait of a really strong woman. And I chose that period so that I could have a feminist narrative in the late 30s. And also a secret wish was to have that generation of woman. My mother is 92 now. Many of her friends are still alive. Well, several of her friends are still alive. I wanted that generation, as well as women in their 80s and 70s, to read something that was empowering to them now, because I think facing what we're facing right now, given the Supreme Court and all the other stuff that's coming down, I wanted there to be some comforting feminist narrative that an older woman that came of age in a different time could relate to, because I think we never give up being feminists and aspiring to be feminist and having that empowerment happen to us. So I was on a bit of a mission, but I also wanted to write an entertainment and a page turner. So
it definitely is. And I'm just talking a little bit about Gail's book. My great grandmother, very strong woman, but she's like 4'9", and she was not allowed to read or write or go to school because her father said, no, your brothers go to school, you don't. So she basically sat outside of the classroom and she learned how to read and write by just like sitting outside, in the winter or anytime she could. And she just listened to the teachers because she wasn't allowed to go to school. And so anyway, reading your book and about empowerment at that time, and a lot has changed, thank goodness, and a lot hasn't. The woman in my book, the main character leaves home because she thinks she's caused an accident that has paralyzed her brother. But she stays away she can't save him, so she tries to save the world. That doesn't work out too well either. But when she comes home, it's because her mother basically sends her a one-way ticket and says, your brother's getting married in 3 days. And we're also about to go to war in 3 days. And she had just come out of jail because she got arrested at a protest and she wants to go back to jail rather than go home. But she goes home and she faces, this whole family, but the mother character, I mean, this is a little bit autobiographical, but I've fictionalized it a lot over the years. It's 25 years in the making. But the mother character is probably the closest character to my own mother, who was not the person who's, even though she claims to have been the one who made the gravy, it was mostly like my dad and then my stepdad who did a lot of the cooking, which is kind of funny. And they're better cooks, but I know she's not listening, so I can say that. But she is the character, the mother character is the one that this whole family kind of surrounds themselves around. And I think that is very true for a lot of the families that, I know, and just seeing how women are empowered in ways that they don't always get credit for, or that they even see themselves, right? So my mother would have never used, or any of the women that I grew up with would have never used the word feminist, but that's what they were. And in a lot of ways, that feminist movement was, basically for white, wealthy women, and did not really bring in a lot of women like my mother and other people like that who were more working class and from other backgrounds and, that kind of thing. So anyway, so it's yeah, I think there's a lot of themes in that way. And yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, I think I also deal with a lot of it with humor. And I think so. I'd like to think there's a lot of humor in the book. I don't necessarily do that intentionally, but it comes out that way. But this mother who takes herself very seriously in the book also doesn't really necessarily think that she is funny, but she is just by who she is. And I think that's, yeah. And I totally got off the question. So what was the question that you had answered? Yes.
Forgot, right?
Yes.
No, but it's actually incorporating a lot of the other questions I had coming up about how it's relate to your own experience and the culture growing up Italian American. But one of the things that struck me when you talk about inspirations of like in the strong Italian woman at the center of the family heart, or being more of a feminist, no one looked at themselves that way. But during those generations, there were so many struggles going on that people just got involved and they didn't stop to think. And now younger women, I mean, maybe 40 years ago when NOIAW was founded, it was really necessary for women to unite behind one strong voice in order to advance themselves and have a network and support. Things have changed. It's a little bit easier now, but there's still, a lot of people who don't get that. And what I think one of the important lessons, and maybe if you saw it in writing a book like this, is to maybe, and what we're trying to convey at NOIAW is to pass the message on to the next generation that things weren't always this easy, or that you didn't have certain, and how do you connect with that? How do you learn from the struggles of the past? And maybe that's, what's the responsibility to the next generation? So now we're looking at NOIAW the next 40 years, but what is your message maybe to young women who are coming up and thinking they ignore the family to a certain degree? They think, that this balanced life, family, balance with career and work.
Well, it's funny because, the character in the book, I mean, she leaves and comes home like me, right? I left home and then I came back and, I was an activist in the 80s. And everybody, in the 80s, there was a lot of things that were going on, right? We were about to go to war. I mean, there was a lot of things in LA, there's a lot of things, everything that happened with Rodney King. I mean, and I think a lot of young women today don't necessarily always appreciate what came before. And now that they're getting like Gail mentioned, hit with things in the Supreme Court, and people are like, how is this even happening? It's like, well, look at the history, right? I mean, in the 80s, there were no laws that protected women, from being discriminated against. And we still don't have those laws like the IRA amendment. We don't have any of those today, right? So I think we need to learn from the past by realizing the past is really also here in the present, and that the women who have come before in these organizations like NOAA are important. Even writers, we have organizations because you need each other to create those groups that you can rely on and give you the support, and just give you the hope that things can get better, but you don't need to do it alone. And I don't think you can do it alone. So I think, it's important to come together and realize what our elders and have done, and the struggles that we continue to have now, and our next generations continue to have now. And they only seem to be more and more, right? In the world that we're living in now, it's not like, racism or classism or all those isms are gone. I mean, if anything, under certain last administration, and even, they've come to the surface more than ever. And I think it's important more than ever that people realize that you can't ignore the past, right? So whether you learn from the past or you don't, it's still there. And that's why we're here today. Even the pandemic.
Pat, I wanted to say something about, you mentioned elders. And it's such an important aspect to, I really was worried about how the elders, my grandmother's generation, they're mostly gone, but my mother's generation would respond to this book, the feminism in it and the choices that my main character makes. I was worried that there was too much feminism, that they would be offended by the decisions that my character makes. And I was blown away and completely surprised that even among the most conservative friends of my mother's, how excited they were by it and how empowered they were by the decisions. And so I wouldn't say that I necessarily choose to speak more to the elders, but I feel like they're a great place to start to empower, because everyone always focuses on young women. In my experience, my daughter's 34. And for ages, she just thought all the battles had been won and wondered why I was even still a feminist. And then she graduates from college and she gets out in the world, and suddenly she sees what's there that seems like business as usual, like the cool guys that she went to college with turn into really conservative kind of privileged guys, in the work world. And she was, I think, shocked, because she said, why are you still a feminist? We have this, we have that. And now she understands, but she didn't in her 20s. So I don't know to what extent. I hope we can empower younger women. And I think a lot are, but they've got bigger problems, as big a problem, like global warming, they're really, they're inheriting quite a world that's changed so fast. So
I think it has to be a dialogue, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from younger women that I have to keep my ears open to. Like my daughter, they do know things that we didn't know. But I think it's that back and forth between what was before, what is now. There's all these different generations. As someone who's between my mother and my daughter's generation, I realize, there's both sides has a lot to learn if we just listen to each other. I think, like you said, we're surprised by what we think is going to offend people. We realize no, because it was their experiences and the choices that they made that they may have not been able to be public about, right? But they understand it. So
totally.
And now with social media, everybody seems like everybody's saying what they're thinking, and they're not. That was the thing. The family in this book, and many families I know, we may be very loud, but we're not saying a lot of the things that need to be said, right?
Yeah.
The louder we are, the more secrets we have, right? That's kind of like, something I grew up with understanding. So.
So let's go back to some of those things that we grew up with and how we accept them. So now there are a lot of superstitions and rituals or religious rites, and in both the books. And so how the characters come to accept these elements of their faiths, but at the same time, they defy them by with varying interpretations. So I think about the symbolism in Last Stop on the Sixth of the saint statues, the little plastic saints that the main character's brother carries around with him, and how he has to, they all have a special meaning. The saint has the power of this and the saint that, but also then there's symbolism what's behind them, and then it's adapted to empower, for yourself in real events, or even like in the Italian love cake, what's the ingredients of the magical herbs that are used in these cakes to help stir or stare at the future of what she wants to happen, to cover outcomes. So can you share what are the points, the elements of this new story, and maybe explain a little bit about the way the main character gets into baking the cakes and how she alters the ingredients to make it appropriate to what she wants as the outcome.
You mentioned before about cooking and food and controlling through food, and the way I interpret that is, women, we bring the food to the table, and there's always an intention. Okay, there's a big holiday meal, and there's a lot of love, and all the relatives are there. Maybe I'm talking really divisive politics when we would argue more gently at holidays. But, you bring the food to the table, and it's either Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter or a Jewish holiday, and you bring it to the table and you want everyone to enjoy the food, and there's a lot of love in it. And I don't like to use the word manipulation, but I think women, the power center has been the kitchen for a lot of women, certainly for Italian American women, and our food is beyond delicious. There's every reason why it wows. Everyone loves Italian food. So when I first started researching the herbs, because I thought I wanted Marie to take control of her life any way possible. And her mother is dead. She talks to her in this little shrine room called the ex voto, where her mother's stuff is. And she finds these artifacts from her mother. And so she has this area of inspiration. And I like to say it's like shaking the 8 ball. Like, what should I do, Mom? Yes, no, those black 8 balls that used to tell you the message. So she goes into the ex voto and she's wondering what her mother would advise her in all these various situations. And so that's the positive part of it. She relies on that. She's equally a little offended, or I'll use the word grossed out, by a lot of the superstitions. And I thought of the scapulars that my aunt wore around her waist with those brown strings and the little holy pictures of Saint Simon it was. And it goes back to 1250, so 13th century. And on the flip side of the picture of Saint Simon was, whosoever dies in this garment shall not suffer eternal fire. So it was like this thing. And I remember seeing it pressed under my aunt's pantyhose when I was in the bedroom with her and she'd be undressing, and thinking, oh, that thing is disgusting. And so I wanted to have this mixed feeling as a woman. The monks, of course, wore the scapulars around their waists, around their necks, but my aunt wore hers around under her pantyhose. And it was revolting to me. And also when Marie Genovese, my main character, her aunt arrives from Italy, there is this very Italian woman, and Marie wants to be American. She has the store on the main street, and she's a little bit repulsed. There are other reasons why she's afraid that the aunt's there. There's some family secrets, but I wanted to have the push and pull between loving the ritual and being comforted by it and growing up with it and having it in you, but also having it be too visceral, too fleshy, too hell and damnation. So Marie is, there's a push and pull around those. I love the plastic saints in Last Stop on the Sixth.
Yeah, well, I mean, where I grew up, superstition, we didn't even use the word superstition, just the way it was. I mean, I think there's a line in the book, but it's true. The Exorcist was that was a documentary where, it's just what we all believed. And, you pray to St. Anthony, which I got all these medals I give out with the book because that's one of the classic saints. But, and I grew up Catholic, was raised Catholic, but I converted to a Muslim which is a whole other story and another book. But we still have saints. Everybody has saints because there's this thing on the outside that we look to for guidance. And the brother in this book, because I get very curious about my grandmother had plastic saints. And then when I spent a lot of time in Egypt, and they're all the saints that people have. Everybody has these saints because it's the outside people that you can go to guidance. And the brother in the book collects them. And they're really, if you go online, they're like thousands of different kind of plastic saints, and there's a saint for everything. I don't know if the original intention of the saint, that saint actually was for, you can have a saint for like dog catchers now, right? There's a saint for everything. So he uses the saints to give messages to help the sister find him, because he's gone when she comes back to see him. He's disappeared. But anyway, but the idea of plastic saints and, the things that you wear around your neck, we wear the horns and all these things just to protect us from the evil eye. That's the same thing like in other cultures. I find we all have very similarities. So I was very just curious by that. And I lean into that because I don't know if I'm superstitious, but I do believe in, that there are things beyond us that we can't always explain. And I think that's a lot of what I try to write about, the things that we can't explain, although that we try so hard to make meaning of. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, I don't know, it's also what makes life interesting. I have a lot of friends who are, I have friends that are very, very hardcore scientists, and they all, believe in God or something big larger, because they say as scientists to believe that there's not something beyond them would be like arrogance, right? But I do have some friends who, are hardcore, as they would call themselves, atheists, and that's another religion, right? And I just think that to not believe that there's something beyond us, and that's, I think, what writing's about, trying to figure out what the beyond is, even though we never will, maybe, but it's fun to go on that journey.
So maybe we should think about what's the importance of, the time and the place or the settings in these books and how it leads to greater enlightenment. I just also relating it back to the Neapolitan novels and Ellen Ferrante's book, and how maybe our perception of the Italian culture or women change over the time. So like you see in Ellen Ferrante's book, the importance of education is completely not, as you said with your grandma, not adaptable to the young woman who has to stay home and cook and clean. And she spends all her time in the summer reading all those books to catch up because she can't go to school because she has to go to work, or your grandmother sat outside because she wasn't allowed. But then and that was Naples and the whole culture, because it was driven by someone had to go to work, and the society had to move forward. The mother was in the kitchen or whatnot in the schoolroom. But how does that affect, you think, passing that lesson on to the current generation, but also what the setting, what you have in your books from, the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, some of a desolate place and fitting in, and then finding your way as a young independent feminist, or in the Bronx, New York City, going back and forth. Where does it, the place, the setting have to do with how you find yourself, or what do you have to do to come to that point?
Well, I think the setting of this book is all about, it's funny, the neighborhood, Pelham Bay or the Bronx, I tell people when they ask me, where'd you grow up? I say, oh, a small town. Because there was this insular idea that everybody was from, Italy and Southern Italy, although like my family is actually from Northern Italy. Well, my grandfather was Southern. We're kind of mixed, and we have some Sicilian in there, but there's this idea that, during that time, I remember growing up personally, like the Vietnam War was going on, and I had an uncle that was in Vietnam, but people didn't really talk about that, right? Everything was about what was happening in the neighborhood, and everybody knew what was happening. Everybody knew each other's business, but the outside world and events, which is something that you just kind of kept outside. And I think what I tried to write about here is a woman, in the 90s, she left home in the 80s, comes back, and then here we are on the precipice of another war, which, people worry is going to be another like Vietnam. And she comes home for her brother's wedding, and then has a lot of different nights. And then finds out things about, the fiance who may go to war, which wouldn't have happened, right? I mean, she's a woman going to war. And so I think that what I've done and or tried to do here, and not even maybe consciously at first, is to show how things have changed, but it's almost like the mother in this book. I intentionally, the men in this book do all the cooking, right? And that was something that was intentional because the men in my family now do all the cooking. But growing up, my grandmother, she did all the cooking and she also went to work. And so there was this movement of like, yeah, what happened to women? Well, they got to stay home and cook and take care of the kids, but then they had to go to work too. And so what were we really winning, right? So I think it's all about choice, whether you decide that you want to be able to have the choice to be able to raise your kids and have kids in a healthy environment, or you don't, and you want to be able to go out or be creative. And I think that a lot of what this book where I try to deal with is what is the choice that the people in the book, but especially the women in the book have. And a lot of the women that, and a lot of my friends growing up didn't have the same kind of choices. I mean, because we were the Americans, I did have a brother, like the brother in the book that was a child actor. And my parents were able to be exposed to other things. We went into the city. That's Manhattan, for those of you. If you're from the Bronx, the city means Manhattan. And we saw plays and, we went to the toy museum. That was F.E.O. Schwartz, but my father called it the toy museum. So we wouldn't actually ask to buy any of the toys because they were too expensive. So when I found that out, I was like 20. I thought, wow, that was brilliant. Anyway, but we went outside of that world. And a lot of the women, especially my friends, didn't have those choices. They couldn't leave the block. If their father whistled, that meant they had to come and sit down. And I watched how their brothers had more choices than they did. And so being on the outside of that a little bit and having a mother who was not necessarily, she was accepted because my mother's personality in our neighborhood, and she helped people, but she was kind of like the woman who just like helped the other woman just kind of do the things they needed to do. That they, and if they were, my mother basically would have been a social worker, I think, or, maybe a politician if she had the education, but she was able to expose the other women, I think, in the neighborhood to things that they didn't necessarily get to see on their own because of the limitations. And so in the 90s, where the book takes place, some of that has changed or had changed, but not as much as you would expect. So I think in some ways, a lot of this is about like, who are the pioneers, and I don't think we stop. And when you say the heroines, I mean, I think there's so many heroines in like all of history and where I grew up, and the biggest heroines I think were the women who actually had to, raise their kids, take care of everything, and just, they kept things going, right? And they kept the kids safe and their family safe, and I don't think they ever got the credit that they kind of deserved. And anyway, so.
Gail, I think we're probably running out of time now, but do you want anything to add to that, or just in conclusion, maybe about the issue of choice? And
yeah, well, I just want to speak to the insularity of our communities, a lot of our Italian American communities, and then the pressures coming in from the outside world. And there were a lot of examples in my town, and we feel this as Italians because we feel other. And my neighbors were best friends with the anthropologist Margaret Mead. And we lived on a lake, and my mother would run into the house and say, Margaret, Mrs. Seeley's out on the paddle boat with Margaret Mead. And, we'd rush down to see Mrs. Seeley on the paddle boat with Margaret Mead. And so Margaret Mead's mother came to our town in 1905. She was hired by the U.S. Department of Immigration to write about Italians. And she wrote this really awful report, but it was in the same genre of the time. It was called Italians on the Land. And the stuff it said about us, it was just virtually eugenics. And it was almost like skull size and brain size, though maybe not quite. And I've written about this in my personal essays. And so my family was very aspirant not to be Italian. And so it was very impactful to be next door to these people who were academics, quite bright, and Margaret Mead coming to stay with them. We never met her, actually. We weren't introduced because we were like two different species living side by side. But here we were in the southern New Jersey Pine Barrens, in the most isolated place you can imagine. And so the outside world did press in, but it pressed in this kind of very strange way. And just briefly about Ferrante, I felt like that she made Italians interesting and made Italian Americans more interesting, I think, to the American reading market. And that was my hope, that she broke it open for Italian and Italian American writers. And I think
Especially women.
and women, and as you know, like Europa editions and all the things that are coming out because of her. So I think that, you know, apart from the topics, she's been a real trailblazer, and we're benefiting, you know, I think.
And we don't know why. I just want to say, interestingly, she kept her identity in Italy a secret for decades. And of course, when you come here, you can't do that because they'll figure it out. But
I know, lucky her. She just gets to
yeah.
write.
Yeah, she's able to get to write and live her life. But
Well, thank you. That's been really great and enlightening. I really appreciate it. And maybe we have some questions from the audience. Somebody has something to say. Charity, has anyone put any questions in the chat box?
Yeah.
Or anybody
Yes.
want to unmute and speak,
Yeah, you
ask a
can ask
question,
anything
raise
you
your
want.
hand?
We do have a question from Jennifer in the chat. This is for both authors. Why do you think people of all backgrounds, not just Italian Americans, should read your books? And what about your books may help to dispel unrealistic stereotypes about Italian Americans?
Well, you don't necessarily have to read our books. I think you just have to buy them.
Or
Yeah,
go to your
right, no,
library.
no, so, or go to your library, but then buy them too. No, I think that, well, besides them just being good reads, I think both books give you, like from they give you a part of life. I mean, why do we read? We read because we want an experience. We read because I think we want to learn about things without feeling like somebody's teaching us. And I think both these books like put you in those worlds where you're actually, hopefully, you feel a part of it, right? And you don't have to be necessarily Italian or Italian American to kind of relate to it, because there are so many things that are in common. It's funny, somebody wrote to me and said, "Oh, your book made me laugh. I related to it so much. I married into both those families." And I said, "Oh, you married into Italian American families?" He's like, "No, I'm married into Creole families," but it's the same thing, like families,
Yeah.
like that, that are loud and have all their conflicts and everything else. And underneath it is all love, right? So, I think if you really want, read them because they're good stories, but they're also stories that are, it took me 25 years, the universal, yes, thank you. And yeah, no, I can write, but I never have the right words, but the universe, but I also think there's a lot of heart, and this book has come to me, not, I've had a lot of work. For those of you out there who are writers, I've workshopped it a lot. I've had a lot of amazing readers and editors, so you don't do this alone. But I think you want a great experience, and Italian Love Cake, I know that, like, I didn't want to leave that world. So if you want to be somewhere that you're going to love being, even if sometimes you're feeling nervous or uncomfortable or because of the conflict, that's a great place to be. And how many Netflix shows can we watch? Anyway, go ahead.
I agree with everything you just said. And I want to say too, that we read, the reason I read is because novels particularize experience. And so they are so specific to the people come alive, and they are really nuanced. And the thing that I don't like in any kind of ethnic literature, if I can use that phrase, is the nostalgia and the whitewashing and that kind of, oh, grandma was just patting the dough. And then, that kind of sweet, artificial. And I think the stereotypes come in about Italians that were just about meatballs, or were just about guns, And when you read about real people are complex. And that's why I read fiction, for the
No, but
complexity.
that's perfect, because it's true. Your characters have to
Yeah.
be flawed. They're not perfect. I mean, and I want to just put it out there. We talked about food. My grandmother was an awful cook. I mean, awful. And, you know, and you really took your chances when you went and you had to eat there, because, you know, there are all these things that I think that our books, or any books, like you say, if they don't stereotype and they make the characters, you know, they're not adored and perfect, they're flawed, but they're also I mean, I try to do too is break that whole stereotype that even the character comes back from Hollywood and she starts seeing things that, you know, wasn't even the reality she grew up in, but she thinks that there's certain things are connected, like mafia related, which, you know, I don't want to give away the book, but they're not. I mean, because there are all these stereotypes that people have about Italians or about any group. And I think that's, you know, what these novels and other novels try to do is when they're really good, they show you the imperfections, and they don't, and that's why it took me so long. I had to stop protecting the characters and I had to make them like not be perfect.
Yeah, I can really relate to that.
Yes.
Great. We have another question. This is for Gail. Did you have a family member that lost property gambling? And when will the Italian edition of your book come out?
Well, God, that's really, really interesting. Yes, I actually did have, there is a bit of a gambling problem on my father's side, and the men in my father's side, bit of a gambling problem. And that's so funny because I didn't really fully put that together until you asked it. Interesting. Yeah. I'm hoping for, so yes, and I'm hoping for an Italian translation. I don't know, Bordighera talks about that. Pat and I were talking about that. I'm really delighted that the French have picked it up, and I'm learning a lot about the difference in publishing among European countries. And to answer, Pat Tinto, your question at the beginning about Liberata, the French decided to give it an Italian title, which thrilled me because the translator said the French love Italian titles and they love anything Italian. And I thought, okay, that's really great. And I love the title because they honed right in on the feminism and the liberation, and they just ran with it. And it's interesting, you know.
And yeah, by the way, my great grandfather was a gambler and did lose money, did lose land in Italy. Yeah, it's weird. That's another connection that we have. It's kind of strange.
My
We
mother
have
went to the casino.
Oh, that's it. My mother, she still go. Yeah. That's
I have
pretty
a
good.
comment from Louisa. She says, thank you for this wonderful presentation and the concept that in so many ways our female ancestors were so valuable, heroic, and yet unrecognized. Your books will help to shift that. Do you have any male characters who see the women this way in your books? I look forward to reading the books.
Well, I do. But I think that the male characters in the book, especially, I mean, if you read it, you'll see, I think they know who has the power, and it's clear that it's the woman. Yeah, I don't think they even try to pretend otherwise. And then not just the mother character, but it's not said, but it's there.
And I have one character who sees Marie's strength and respects her for it, and that's her brother, Sammy. So there's a good brother and a bad brother, but Sammy really sees it. He really understands. He's in her corner. I'm embarrassed by this question because there's just one. The rest of the men are not, don't quite have the same level of perception about her, including her lover, sadly. These are great questions.
Yes, I know. They're
Sharon.
hard.
Charity, do we have any others? I can't read the chat from here.
That was the last one on chat. So if we have time, we could let anyone who wants to ask a question unmute themselves.
You can ask us anything. I could tell you about what I did yesterday, or
Well, I have one question. Does anybody have a new book in the works or?
I have a new book that my agent's it's got out in the world now, which I hate to, it's working title, so excuse us. It's about, well, at the heart of it is a father-daughter relationship. I read a lot about exterminators. There's another exterminator in the book, but it's called How I Killed Your Mother. And it's really about, it's a serial killer book. So, but ironically, even though it's about a serial killer, it's really about love and family, and it just has another twist on it. Yeah, and exterminators. Yeah, actually, a lot of people have a little bit. Yeah, I write about. I don't know. I have an obsession with exterminators and child actors, which is also in that book too. So,
Gail, do you have anything else coming with?
And I'm
This was
working
your
on a
first
memoir,
novel?
yeah.
Did you say?
This is my first novel. There are two in a box that never made it out, and a memoir in a box that never made it out. But they're one of the ones that I started many years ago is set in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, and it's not Italians. It's Southern New Jersey Pine Barrens. It's more ecological. It's fire and global warming. And I may be going back to that, but then just recently there's a character in Italian Love Cake that's been pulling me, and that's the mysterious Aunt Ada from Italy. And she occurs to me. I dreamt about her the other night. I got up in the middle of the night and there was something I had to write down about her. So maybe I'm going to write a follow-up, or maybe. So I don't know right now. I'm in the thick of promoting this book, and so I'm not really sure. Not sure.
So Gail, I just want to say quickly, in the summers, we used to go to Long Beach Island in Jersey and the Jersey Shore, but
Yeah.
we would read about the Jersey Devil and the Pine Barrens. So talk about superstitions. All of us believed that was true. And when we ever heard that somebody was from the Pine Barrens, we're like, oh my God, how could you, isn't it very scary to live there? So anyway, so maybe someday we'll talk about the Jersey Devil, because I'm so curious about that whole myth.
Let's do it. Let's do it. I've never had a sighting, but scary stuff happens when you're out in the woods there at night. And
Yeah.
we did a lot of that as teenagers.
I think we
Oh.
have one more question that came in, and then we're going to wrap it up. But before we do that, I just want to encourage everybody, to take a look at these books and IM books if you like interested in purchasing. To also go to our website, NOIAW.org, NOIAW, and see what upcoming events we're going to be celebrating. A couple Christmas holiday luncheon in Long Island. Washington, D.C. is presenting a special program on traditions of Christmas past. And we actually, I think we haven't had one about Hanukkah, but we're looking into one about La Befana. And also we're going to have an Epiphany celebration virtually this year. Again, we're forced to go through a Zoom format, but we're honoring 3 wise women, one from Connecticut,
Oh,
one
nice.
from New York, and one from the greater Washington, D.C. area. So if you look on our website, follow social media, please, check out those invitations to come. But the one last question I saw was that somebody asked Gail about she was studying herbs and about her book, and how did that, Charity, see that question about, you mentioned
Yeah,
studying
It's from
herbs. And
Sharon. She said you mentioned studying herbs to empower your character. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, there's a big tradition of use of herbs in all cultures, not just Italians for sure. And so I used it as a plot device as Marie tries to change her life and make things better for herself. So there are herbs like anise, which we know from Pitzel or various cookies. And anise, honestly, can do so many different things. It's almost like when I was researching the herbs, several of them do everything. So I was looking for the specificity, like which herb for love, which herb for marriage, they're just really, you just use herbs. And then also in the book, there's a herbal abortion. And so I wanted to show the many ways that women in all communities have used herbs. And it was really interesting doing the research. There was this Dr. Trotula from Salerno, I can't remember, I think 16th century or 17th century, who wrote about the use of herbs. And then of course it's Artemis who comes up with a herb that can supposedly abort a fetus.
Yeah, well, women healers in Italy were all
Yeah.
using herbs. Yep, and they
And
they were called-
Wicca, little Wicca in there.
Yeah, well, they were called stregas, but they were not, and they were so respected that they were not like burnt and killed the way they were here in the United States, because they were too part of the culture. They're the ones that, Italian healers that were all women.
Well, they were
for-
healers,
for
and
help.
Marie is a healer. Marie puts these herbs in and she
Yes,
cures
exactly.
this one's thing. She's helped a number of people in town, which helps enhance her reputation because other things they don't like about what she does, but they like that she can heal.
Keep you alive. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. So I think Charity, unless is it, there anything else to conclude? Are we-
Now, can I
No,
just say?
I reshared the link for the books to use that coupon code and also the websites for both authors.
Yeah, so if you email me at my website, I'll put you on my newsletter, but you can email me about writing. If those of you are out there writers that want to ask any questions, because I've been teaching it also for 18 years, but anything that you want to send me a note about, please do.
Same here.
And I think their names are on their websites. It's Gail Reitano author.com, right? Or is it in Patricia Dunn?
GailReitano.com, but if you Google me, it just comes up.
And I'm Patricia Dunn author.com because there's so many Patricia Dunns in the world. I had a sick author in there. Anyway.
Okay.
But
All right.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you
Brilliant.
to the Norwalk Public Library. I
Yes.
see Cindy joined us on host for giving us this opportunity to get together. And we hope to see you again soon in
Yes.
one of our other programs. And and feel free if you have any questions to write to me at ptinto@noia.org or charity@noia.org. And we'll be happy to get back in touch with you. We hope to see you again on
Yes,
another
yes.
Zoom or
And
another
thank you,
in
Pat.
person.
Pat, you were fantastic. Hardest
Thank you.
questions I've gotten in all these